Am I unmuted now? Looks like it. Thank you.
Yep, you're unmuted.
Thanks, Greg. Fred, I see your chat thing. Do you need us to unmute you, or are you okay? Just respond in the chat button. You know, I didn't ask Greg whether or not I'm on a speakerphone today rather than on a headphone because I'm in someone else's office. Does it sound all right?
Sounds okay to me.
Okay.
Do I sound okay?
Yeah, you sound great.
Greg, can you hear me?
Yes?
Hi, it's Krista.
Hi.
Is everything going well? Do you need anything on my end?
I think we're doing good so far.
Okay, great. I'll check back at the top of the hour here.
Okay, thank you.
Greg and Freda, just so you know, I did put on our office phone the Greg, your email address, and Freda's cell phone number. So either you're getting emails or everything's quiet, or Freda, you're on the phone.
Yeah, so far we only have 3 other people who just joined, so.
Okay, great.
Thank you for joining us today. We will begin promptly at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you're having any technical difficulties, please send an email to nagy.8@osu.edu or use the chat function at the right of the screen. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. We will begin promptly at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you're having any technical difficulties, please send an email to nagy.8@osu.edu or use the chat function at the right of the screen. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. We will begin promptly at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you are having any technical difficulties, please send an email to nagy.8@osu.edu or use the chat function at the right of the screen. Thank you. Thank you for joining us today. We will begin promptly 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you're having any technical difficulties, please send an email to nagy.8@osu.edu or use the chat function at the right of the screen. Thank you. Welcome to today's webinar titled Identifying Root Causes, Step 2 of the 5-Step Program Improvement Process. My name is Greg Nagy, and I am the Virtual Learning Community Manager from The Ohio State University, who provides technical support for the STEM Equity Pipeline Project. Before we start the presentation, I'd like to go over some housekeeping items for this webinar. This webinar is scheduled to last roughly 1 hour, and is being recorded in order to view this presentation in its entirety later. The recorded webinar will be available in the next few days on the www.stemequitypipeline.org website. As you've already found out, you'll be watching the presenter present slides through the WebEx interface while listening to them talk over your phone. If you cannot get the WebEx software to work today, you can download today's slides from the homepage of the stemequitypipeline.org website and follow along using your phone. All the attendees' phones have been automatically muted. The presenter will answer questions after the presentation. However, we can take questions at any time. This is how we take questions. At any time during the presentation and during the Q&A, you may submit a question by typing it in the Q&A panel at the bottom right of your WebEx screen. The presenter or I will read and respond to the questions at the end of the presentation. I would like to start the webinar by introducing Mimi Lufkin, CEO, National Alliance for Partnerships in Equity Education Foundation, and STEM Equity Pipeline Project Director. Mimi?
Well, good afternoon and good morning for those of you on the West Coast. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Let me first of all apologize to those of you who are participating today who had originally put this on your calendar for approximately 2 weeks ago. I unfortunately came down with the flu and wasn't able to do the webinar that day. Not that I wouldn't have liked to. I don't think you all would have liked having me there. So for those of you who were able to open this point in their schedules to join us today, I really appreciate it. And those of you who are moving it, made it available to you, welcome. As you know, the STEM Equity Pipeline Project has inherently in it this kind of core training component that we're doing with the states that we're working with around the 5-step program improvement process. We did a webinar on September 5th, which was an overview of the 5-step process. It's archived on the website at stemequitypipeline.org if you want to go and review it. And on November 5th, we did a webinar specifically on Step 1, which was documenting performance results, and that webinar is also archived on the site. Today, we're going to focus on Step 2, identifying root causes, and so we might as well get started. First of all, let me just review with you quickly the goals of the STEM Equity Pipeline Project. We basically have 3 goals. The first is to build it's really the professional development capacity of the formal education community to integrate gender equity and STEM into STEM-related professional development events that are going on in the states that we're working in. In addition, we do this through our online virtual learning community, this webinar being one of those activities. The second is to institutionalize the implemented strategies by connecting the outcomes to existing accountability systems. And in this case, we're really looking at the connection between the accountability that's under No Child Left Behind, in addition to the accountability in Perkins for career and technical education. And the third is to broaden the commitment to gender equity in STEM education. And we do this in a variety of ways, and one of the ways in which we do this is through a national advisory board that we have that consists of a variety of organizations, approximately 24 national groups. And it just so happens that Cisco has a representative on our national advisory board, that's Carol McGillen, and she's been a great advocate for the work that we do. And today, Cisco and the Cisco Networking Academy, excuse me, is sponsoring today's webinar, and I'd really like to thank them. And I'd particularly like to thank Krista Hughes, who is the representative from Cisco who's been working with us on setting up the technical specifications and getting the WebEx software use available to us. So again, Krista and Cisco and the Cisco Networking Academy, thanks and kudos to you all for your help with this particular webinar. This slide that you see on the screen is our model. Again, we have this National Advisory Board that provides advice and access to resources like today's webinar. To the project, we have a group of extension services agents, basically experts who provide technical assistance and professional development, both through the virtual learning community on the online training as well as directly to participants who are members of state teams. And also, those services then trickle down to local educational representatives, teachers, et cetera, through training that we do in the states that we're working in, either at conferences, either online, in person at conferences, and providing technical assistance. So it's kind of a trickle-down model. But let's find out who's on today's webinar. I've always interested in this, having a better sense of who's on the call, which also will help me sort of focus where I might provide more information. And what's going to happen here is that Greg's going to pop up on the right-hand side of the screen in a moment a polling area that will have this question as well as the 6 responses that you can possibly take a look at. And then you just click on one of those and to determine which category you fall under, and then at the bottom of the screen there'll be a submit button. There it is. So if you would identify which group that you would affiliate yourself with, and then hit the submit button down at the bottom right-hand side of the screen. We'll take a look at the responses to those in just a minute. You have about 45 seconds to respond to this poll. While we're doing that, let me just go ahead and move forward in the presentation. We did a presentation already on step 1, documenting performance results. That was a webinar that we conducted on November 5th. Again, it's archived at the STEMequitypipeline.org website, and I would encourage you to go take a look at it. And then today we're going to take a look specifically at step 2, identifying root causes. What are the reasons why students do or do not participate either in non-traditional career and technical education programs or STEM-related programs, which are considered non-traditional for women. I'll primarily focus on that issue today. Well, it looks like we have a good smattering of individuals participating in today's call from all over the place. We have a few no-answer folks who either didn't get in there fast enough or being sidetracked by other things going on in their office, which I know can happen. Looks like the largest group is in the other category, so I probably ought to work on building some different categories in here. But we've got counselors, state agency staff, and school administrators, as well as a few teachers as well. So looks like a broad group. Well, let's move right into step 2 then, identifying root causes. Why is this an important step? Why can't we just document where the gaps are and immediately jump to identifying a strategy or solution? And again, and this is a common theme when I discuss this, it's really about trying to keep you from fixating on the fact that there might be some silver bullet strategy out there. One of the things that's really important in the process of trying to drive program improvement is to really look at the conditions or factors that occur to permit a performance gap to happen. And so what are the things that are really creating the performance gap that you see after you do your data analysis? Well, there are 2 types of causes, one being a direct cause, the other being indirect cause. And one of the things that you need to really look at as you're doing your analysis for root causes is trying to get to the most direct cause, the one that's really creating the impact. Because it's very easy to kind of get sidetracked by sort of the indirect things that are more on the outlying range of root causes. Like, for example, in this case, you could say that the problem really exists with the fact that we have a lack of participation in certain programs with teacher training. Teachers aren't prepared. And so the obvious problem is that it resolves or sits itself in the teacher training institutions. And so if all we did was fix teacher training, add a course or curriculum or standards related to equity and instructional practice, that would fix the instructional practice issue. And you all know that that's not the case. What really matters is whether or not teachers are using that knowledge in the classroom. And so probably a more effective strategy would be to implement some sort of a supervision model in a school where the principal or the person who has responsibility for teacher supervision would incorporate these kinds of standards into the supervision process. And so really getting to the root of things is what's important here, and the direct cause being very important. There are a couple of documents that I'd like to bring your attention to that are resources in relationship to this that I will talk about root causes today, but I'd like to refer you back to these 2 documents as references. And they're both available on the STEMequitypipeline.org website. This one is, a review of the research that we did specifically to non-traditional career and technical education. And it has a lot of STEM-related research in it, too. It's a distillation of the research, and I'd recommend that you go take a look at that. The second one is a document that was created by Ruta Sevo and Daryl Tubin, both who are exceptional researchers in this field. Ruta previously was with the National Science Foundation, the program director there for the Gender in Science and Engineering program. And they've done a piece on bias literacy. It's fantastic. I'd suggest you go read it. It's also available on the STEM Equity Pipeline website. And it basically is a review of concepts and research on discrimination. This is the homepage of the site. If you go ahead and go to the resources menu, at the bottom of the resources menu, you can see there's 5-step program improvement process training resources. You want to click on that, which will bring you then to this page that has all of the 5-step process training materials on it. The first document that I mentioned is this one, Improving Performance on Perkins' 3 Core Indicators, Summary of Research on Causes and Improvement Strategies. And the second document is the piece on bias literacy. If you click on the bias literacy link there in the parentheses, that will get you the bias literacy document. So I would encourage, while I'm talking, you can shrink your WebEx browser if you'd like to and go to our website, download these documents and print them or review them online or take a look at them after the webinar is over. It's a great review because basically everything I will say today is pretty much outlined in both of these documents. So let's take a look at what some of the root causes are. And again, let me encourage you, if you have a question, to go ahead and include it in the Q&A section of the WebEx screen on your right-hand side. All you need to do is type in your Q&A in that area, and we'll either pick those up as we go along, or at the end of the presentation I'll have a chance to respond to those. I'm going to talk about, first of all, sort of a group of root causes that are fairly broad-reaching, that could potentially be in or outside of the control of an educational institution, but they certainly are all things that educators, administrators, counselors, teachers, people who work with young people and adults need to be aware of. The first has to do with social attitudes. There are barriers in our society that discourage women from participating in STEM-related fields. And these are a couple of them. Most of this is described very clearly in Dr. Seville and Chubin's paper. I'd encourage you to go take a look at it. But the first is the theory of gender schema. Basically, all people are exposed to assumptions about gender from birth on. And we all know that girls and boys experience have different experiences in society from the first minute their sex is known through the rest of their lives. And they learn to differentiate things such as their parents, the activities, the toys they play with, the roles in their family, the occupations they might choose to have. And so these things become very internalized and somewhat unconscious. And so those, and being aware of what those are important, because in many ways we need to dispel those assumptions to some degree in order to get people to kind of step outside their comfort zone. The second is this idea of a cumulative advantage, and that is that because of this gender schema that we have in our society, the fact that many small advantages accumulate over time and add up to a larger advantage. And the same thing occurs in the reverse. The disadvantages work the same way in a negative way. Like, for example, small imbalances over time can add up to major differences. When a woman or a minority is denied access to a course, given a slightly lower grade, denied academic assistance, excluded from a study group, not encouraged, denied a fellowship, a job or promotion because of discrimination, they suffer an increasing gap in competition for an opportunity. It's kind of the rich get richer and the poor get poorer theory. And to recover competitive ground, they have to gain more than 1% in qualifications or opportunity to reach the same level as the members of the advantaged group. Now, 1% in your mind may feel very small, but the reality is that that is significant, and it in many ways can explain much of what we see around the issue of the glass ceiling or pay gap, etc. The third is this idea of implicit bias, the fact that we all carry unconscious associations that are actually built around the things that we learn from early on in our lives related to the gender schema idea. And even those of us who consider ourselves to be informed individuals and well-educated regarding equity issues often have our own implicit biases. And I would encourage you to do this. There's Project Implicit at Harvard University. Basically recognize that people are unwilling or unable many times to report their attitudes and beliefs because they are so unconscious. And so many of us are constantly trying to pay attention to these issues and develop assessments for individuals to heighten their awareness about equity issues. But this is a really great online instrument that Harvard's developed for actually an individual. You can go on and you can take this implicit association test, and there are a suite of tests there. One of them has to do with gender and career, and it will actually measure your implicit bias regarding the association of gender to career options. It's kind of interesting. The site warns, if you are unprepared to encounter interpretations that you might find objectionable, please do not proceed further. That's at the very opening entry point of the association instrument. Go there with an open mind and just Google implicit association or project implicit, and you'll find it. It's an interesting thing to do. Media representation. Again, somewhat outside the educational arena, but at the same time, many of these biases can be counteracted by the way in which we teach people to interpret what they're seeing in the media. I just went online when I prepared this PowerPoint and grabbed a couple of pieces that I thought really struck me. And actually, there's a website called aboutface.org if you're more interested in looking at the media's impact on women and girls. And there are a lot of projects that are actually highlighted there that have gone on. Girls Inc. has done a great piece. Gina Davis, the actress who represented the President of the United States in the West Wing series. You may remember that. She's very interested in this and has a whole project that she's doing on this issue. But here are two examples. On the left, you see there's actually an online game called Bimbo City. It totally blew me away, where I assume they're marketing this to young girls to go in and you can do shopping and buying things and dressing like a bimbo, I assume. Pretty frightening. And sort of in retrospect, or in opposite of that, is this advertisement, excuse me, from one of the boot manufacturers here in the U.S., and it says at the top, powerful storm brewing. A storm darkens the path. A human storm won't let the path wash away. Using a steel shovel and an iron will, Angela Bissonette digs the ditches that protect the Appalachian Trail from destructive weather. Timberland is proud to honor someone who pulls her boots and makes a difference. She's not a model. She's a model person. So, one of the things we want to look at is how can we encourage, of course, corporate America to do more advertising that looks like what we see on the right-hand side, and how do we teach young people and adults to interpret what they see in the media appropriately. Another root cause, a very important one, is early exposure. What we find is that most students pursuing a non-traditional career have a friend or a family member that have influenced them to pursue that area. One of the things that we really encourage educators to do is to think of ways to spark an interest in students that because of the fact that they didn't maybe have that type of exposure, that they can create that in an educational environment. And, of course, the earlier the better. And so for those of you who are on this call who may be either working in community colleges or in high schools, one of the things that we encourage also is for people to reach down and to partner with elementary schools and look at how these kinds of important messages and information can be brought to students early on. Non-traditional role models. Probably the strongest evidence in the research indicates that non-traditional role models are imperative in this whole issue. The lack of their appearance can be a great deterrent for students to consider participating in a STEM-related field or a non-traditional career. And that means that they don't see people that look like them doing a certain job, and therefore the message is that that occupation is not for them. Role models can come from all over the place. They can be family members who are significant and are hugely significant, the research indicates, oftentimes very important in this process. Teachers are very strong role models for students. And, of course, people from the community who can serve as mentors through a variety of activities. But non-traditional role models, either the lack of them can be a deterrent, or the infusion of non-traditional role models into students' lives can definitely increase their potential and interest in pursuing a non-traditional career. Self-efficacy. There's a huge body of research around self-efficacy. I'm just going to talk about three things quickly here. Again, I'd encourage you to go take a look at Dr. Chubin and Sevo's paper, as well as the document that we've done. But there are three things I want you to think about. One is this idea of what we call attribution theory. And again, there's a body of research about the fact that girls and boys process success and failure somewhat differently. And whether that is because of the way in which society has infused the gender schema in their thinking, or what, it's interesting to pay attention to, because teachers can have direct impact on trying to increase the ability of girls to attribute their success to more internal factors rather than external factors, which is typically what girls tend to do. When a girl is successful, they tend to want to say, it's because I was lucky, I was in the right place at the right time. It's more about external factors than it is about the fact that they were smart, or they really knew the material, or something that's more internal. And they may attribute it to the fact that they worked really hard rather than them being very smart. And so one of the things that we've seen, especially in the research around math and science, is that because of the fact that girls attribute their success typically more externally, that they perceive poor performance, or even slightly poor performance, like getting a B in a math course, as a very negative indicator to their success in mathematics, where that doesn't typically happen with boys. So again, teachers encouraging students and giving them feedback about their success, especially girls, is really, really important. Another area is this area of stereotype threat. Basically, the theory of stereotype threat holds that when an individual is made aware of his or her identity in a group that is negatively stereotyped for that activity, their performance will be impaired, basically confirming that negative stereotype. And this is an effect that can be triggered without explicit reference to the stereotype. For example, exposing individuals to strong cues about their group's identity, gender, race, age, etc., prior to a test can trigger that effect. As simple as filling out a form that asks the subjects that asks the test taker to identify their group, that's enough oftentimes to trigger stereotype threat. Now, this body of knowledge has been repeated over and over again, and we're going to be doing a webinar on December 17th, and we'll mention it again at the end of the presentation today, specifically on this theory, and I'd encourage you to participate in that. The third has to do with locus of control, and basically when girls feel that they're in control of their lives and their futures, they're more likely to select non-traditional options. If their sense of self is very much that they are victims, or that other people have control of their future, or that they're not in a position to make decisions about their themselves and their future, again, they're less likely to step outside of the traditional stereotypical role in order to look at career options. Again, an area in which, you're not going to, an educational institution isn't going to change the family demographics of a student, but being aware of that family demographics can sometimes explain some of the things that they may be experiencing with a student, and also give you a point at which you can help do some intervention. But basically, research has shown that girls with lower socioeconomic status parents have higher sex stereotyping scores. What this means is that girls from low-income families tend to stay within traditional norms much more so than girls from higher socioeconomic status parents. So you'll see, possibly, anecdotally in your own situation, that girls that come from higher income families possibly might be more likely to select a non-traditional career. The opposite effect occurs with boys, interestingly enough. The higher socioeconomic status parents of boys from families who are of higher socioeconomic status parents have higher sex stereotyping scores. So it would be lower income boys would be more likely to choose non-traditional career areas. Interesting phenomenon. And the third point about this is that family structure, in other words, whether it's single parent family, dual parent family, where this student sits in terms of a string of siblings or the number of siblings, as well as the level of education, really has no effect on this choice in the family demographic schema. It really has to do with issues of economic status. So another thing to pay attention to. So one of the things we want to know about is who can really influence students' career choice. I mean, we all can to some degree, but what does research tell us about who the primary influencer is of student career choice? And what I'd like to ask you to do now is we're going to pop a poll up here in a minute and have you tell me who you think of these 6 groups is the primary influencer of a student's career choice. Is it the school guidance counselor? Is it a teacher? Is it the student's peers or friends who influence them the most? Is it the student's parent that is the primary influencer? A relative, not necessarily immediate parent, but an aunt, an uncle, someone else in the family that they are close to? Or is it someone who's an adult that they have communication with, a family friend who potentially has that primary spot? So here's the poll. You have 30 seconds to reply. Just click the radio button that is the one in which you think the correct answer is. And then don't forget to hit the submit button down at the bottom right-hand side of the screen so that your response gets included with the poll results at the end. So do you think it's the school guidance counselor, the teacher, peers or friends, parents, relatives, or some adult family friend? Okay, the poll is ended. Let's take a look and see what the results look like. All right, looks like the majority of the folks on today's webinar, 48%, think it's parents. Well, this is obviously a very well-informed and educated group. That is absolutely right. There have been a variety of studies that have been done with students, freshmen in college, for example, asking them who was the primary influencer of their career choice, and that tends to be, and in these pieces of research, the answer was strongly on the side of the parents. And so parental influence and of course spouse or significant other with adults are huge influencers in this area. Another root cause section, whether or not these individuals are informed about career choices as well as supporting a student's choice. So negative messages from people with emotional influence can oftentimes be very difficult for students to overcome. What about school climate? And we're talking about not necessarily in the classroom in this case, and not particularly about curriculum. It's really about the school environment. And that may mean during school time, after school time, during extracurricular and co-curricular activities, and the representatives of the people who are supporting the school environment, everywhere from the school secretary to the janitors, in addition to faculty. And what does the representation of non-traditional role models on faculty and staff say about the school supporting individuals who make those non-traditional choices? Does the school make an effort in their hiring procedures to ensure that non-traditional role models are part of the selection process that they're using? And what about acceptable behavior in the hallways, in the cafeteria, during school events, on buses? There are lots of places where you have peer-to-peer harassment may be going on that's related possibly to their choice about the courses they've taken or the careers they're pursuing, sexual harassment, bullying, etc. And we all know that that kind of thing needs to be nipped in the bud. There need to be appropriate procedures in place. Ignoring those kinds of behavior is basically condoning that behavior. And how supportive is the administration and staff about encouraging students to consider non-traditional career options and involving non-traditional career role models in any activity or on campus that's going on outside the classroom? Extracurricular activities, whether it be after-school programs, evening parental open houses, career fairs, all college nights, all those kinds of things, is the school being very supportive of bringing non-traditional role models on the campus, and is the climate supportive of that students' participation. Sort of along, I'm moving now into areas in which the school has direct impact. And I want to talk just quickly about career guidance materials and practices. It's more than just the images on brochures and posters. I hear so often when I go around and do training, we talk about career guidance. Everybody always gets sort of stuck in what's happening with the brochures and poster piece, the images stuff, the print material, the online material that's associated with the school. But career guidance practices are significant here. Counselors really can serve as gatekeepers or gate openers, and the opportunity that they have to influence the type of career information that students have access to is huge. And messages about that can be very subtle to quite overt, and sort of taking a look at what's going on in your school in relationship to this area is really important. One of the things I always warn people about is the use of interest inventories for determining students' career selection. One of the things we know from research, and I talked about this briefly under the early exposure root cause, is the fact that really, if you don't know anything about a career, in other words, you've had no exposure to it, you have no idea about what the career option is, how could you possibly have any interest in that area? There are many career fields that individuals, girls particularly in the STEM areas, have not had any exposure or experience with. And so when completing an interest inventory, because of the nature of interest inventory questions, oftentimes their career selection tends to be fairly traditional because those are the things that they've been exposed to. So creating an opportunity for student interest and generating a place for them to create an interest or have some exposure is part of the career guidance practice that really needs to be evaluated. When you're looking at root causes around career guidance materials and practices, what's going on your campus in terms of the types of exposure options that are available for students around career choices? And then how are you using the various tools that career guidance counselors have to help students make choices about their future as well as the courses that they're taking, et cetera. Access to participation in STEM is still on our root cause list. AUW recently came out with a study called Where the Girls Are. If you haven't looked at it, I would encourage you to take a look at it. But it's an interesting piece because it looks very closely at what's going on in terms of the shrinking gender gap in performance on national assessments in mathematics and science between boys and girls. Girls still lag slightly behind as a whole group from boys, very slightly. But when you disaggregate this data by race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status, the gaps become huge. And basically what this means is that if we take a look, for example, at African American girls or Hispanic girls, Native American girls, they lag significantly behind white girls, Asian girls in terms of their performance in math and science on national assessments. So although the gap between all boys and girls has shrunk significantly, and it's interesting because people talk about this as if it's a whole class process and that everyone's moved up. We still, when you disaggregate the information by race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status, we see huge gaps. So we've got a lot of work to do, especially around the intersection of race and gender and socioeconomic status and gender. The other thing that we know is that although girls are succeeding at a much higher rate in their performance on math and science, they still tend to not take as many highly rigorous math courses, physics, for example, some of that very high math in secondary. But even with the achievement that they're obtaining in terms of their SAT scores and all of that sort of thing, and their success in math courses, they're not translating that success into the selection of a STEM career. They don't see the connection between the two things. And so, again, this is another root cause that we need to be paying attention to, and how do we impact that? What about classroom climate? Not talking here about instructional strategies. We'll get to that in a minute. I'm talking about the environment in which a student enters a class. Are they treated fairly by the students and the teacher? Do they feel that they are validated by being there? Is sexual harassment not tolerated by the teacher, or is it ignored, which basically means they're condoning it? And that harassment could be peer-to-peer, and hopefully it's not happening at all between the teacher and the student, certainly. But when there's peer-to-peer issues in the classroom, is the teacher taking care of it quickly? Is the learning environment supportive of that individual's choice to be there? For example, in a highly dominated male classroom, does the girl tend to be the one who takes role or is involved with doing sort of student aid types of activities while the boys are involved with other things that are more curriculum related? What kinds of subtle messages is the teacher giving students in terms of their acceptance in the class itself? They can be everything from the environment of the room, where the classroom, what's going on in terms of the classroom's location on the campus. This is often an interesting issue, especially with career and technical education programs, where maybe the lab or the shop or the facility in which that course is being offered is in a separate building from the main part of the campus, or down a hallway that everyone associates with the shop program. And so there is some sort of stigma that applies to that. Are students encouraged to be involved, and are they welcomed? Physical environment is also very important. Is it a comfortable working location? And although I know this probably doesn't need to be said, there are still, I've been on campuses where there's still problems with issues related to girls having access to appropriate restrooms, places to change into lab dress, different dress for the various activities they might be including. And although many of you think that might be an amazing thing that still occurs, it does happen, especially in buildings that have not been updated. So that's another very strong message to students. What about curriculum materials? I've listed quite a few things here, and there's actually a piece that was written by David Sadker. If you Google his name, he has a great website that has a whole section on each one of these items. But it's everything from, and now we're talking about textbooks and the materials, curriculum materials that you're using are basically women, and I'll use, in this case, let's use women and girls in STEM as the example. You can apply this in any situation for any non-traditional area. But are basically they not apparent? Is there sort of an invisibility of their existence, whether it's in the print references or in visual reference? Is there stereotyping? Does the references in the curriculum have to do with the traditional roles that men or women might play? Is there some imbalance or selectivity in terms of who actually gets represented in, whether it's in the textbook or in the curriculum itself? When curriculum materials sort of do sidebars about, oh, and by the way, did you know that there was this woman scientist? In many ways, that's sort of an isolation issue. In other words, this is some oddity that's going on over here, rather than integrating the things that women have provided to science, as well as the thinking and resources that men have provided, as an integrated approach in the curriculum when addressing anything related to inventions or scientific knowledge, that sort of thing. Linguistic bias is fairly simple, is the pronoun use of he rather than she in reference to anyone who happens to be involved in math or science. And cosmetic bias is an interesting one, because one of the things that David puts in his piece is this whole idea about the fact that changing textbooks, in particular, is a very expensive process. If any of you have been involved with textbook development, you know it can be very expensive. And so oftentimes textbook companies, sort of their solution to this issue is just to fix images and to put in sidebars that address anything from diversity to gender questions. And so it's really important to review text materials to ensure that the entire document itself has integrated this idea into it, not just sort of the image piece has been changed, the pictures in the book have been changed, or these little sidebar pieces have been added. And lastly, this issue of relevance. One of the things we know about girls in STEM is that they're really interested in science and technology, engineering, and math because it changes the world, because it makes the world a better place. It's not about the theoretical knowledge. It's really about the application of that knowledge. And that's true for a lot of students, but it's particularly true for girls. And so how relevant is the curriculum to everyday lives and the potential of making the world a better place to live in? And we know that science, technology, engineering, and math particularly has the ability to do that. And so it's the perfect curriculum to make sure that the types of projects that are selected, the activities that students perform, have a relevant component to it. It's not just about making something jump from point A to point B, but maybe it's more about finding the solution to acid rain or looking at some environmental impact question that has a science or mathematics or physics application. So those are things to think in mind. And so really reviewing curriculum materials for all of these factors is part of the root cause piece. It's not just about the pictures in the textbook. Instructional strategies are really about what are teachers doing in the classroom, what's happening in relationship to questioning level. Are they asking more complicated questions of some students in the class than others? Wait time, as simple as it may sound, wait time is huge. When a question is asked by a teacher and the teacher does not wait at least 10 seconds is sort of the rule, typically you'll see a definite difference in terms of who participates in the response to those questions. One of the things we know is if students who are feeling somewhat marginalized in a class, they may be the only girl, the only boy, or they may be in a small group, they will tend to be the ones who will be less likely to assert themselves in any sort of an oral questioning process. So setting rules and guidelines about how you question and how students respond are an important part of that. And so assessing questioning level, wait time, what's the level of student interaction and feedback that's going on. Classroom management, do you see any disparities in terms of classroom management issues between genders or race? Cooperative learning design, how is the teacher actually managing and manipulating cooperative learning groups in an effort to make sure that girls are not the ones who are always doing the reporting or note-taking? The other thing we know about cooperative learning, there's lots of research in this area, is the fact that when you set up cooperative learning groups, it's imperative that, especially when you have mixed gender groups, that you try to have at least 50-50 males and females and or all gender, separate gender groups. There's some papers on our website that I encourage you to go take a look at in the section under teacher strategies. I'll get to that in a minute, specifically about cooperative learning. But as far as the root cause is concerned, looking at cooperative learning design would be one of the things that sends very strong messages to boys and girls about their role in terms of learning in the classroom. And, of course, assessment and teacher expectations is another area. We're going to be doing, actually, a series of webinars in the spring around generating expectations for student achievement, which is a curriculum project that Dee Grayson is the author of. And it's really about how to work with teachers in a professional development setting where they can actually assess their own instructional strategies and improve their ability to reach all students in the class. So when those come forward, we'll make sure we let you know about those. There's always student attitudes and peer influence. Students certainly influence each other in positive and negative ways. And so taking a look at students' attitudes and beliefs, there are lots of sort of interesting assessments that can be done with that. Acceptance of differences, forgiving our students, how much do they accept each other's differences? Is there sort of this culture of you have to be in the in crowd and everyone else is out on the school campus with young people, and working on changing those, that culture is part of this whole process. What biases and stereotypes do students have? Do they support each other or do they harass each other when students make unusual choices, and how can you as a teacher, administrator, counselor try to set up systems and environments where that support can become the norm rather than the odd thing that happens. Student isolation based on gender. One of the things we know is that a cohort of underrepresented students in a program are more likely to complete than a single individual. One student entering a non-traditional program or one girl going into an engineering program will probably have trouble integrating effectively into the social structure of the class. They will suffer decreased performance as a result of that and will most likely drop out. So if you have the opportunity to schedule students, non-traditional students, girls in STEM programs in groups, 2s, 3s, 4s, even more the better, they're more likely to stay. I'm doing my best to also sort of look for questions as they're popping up here, and it looks like you all are using the chat function quite a bit to do this, but someone's asking me a question about being a little bit unclear about cosmetic bias, and basically I'm going to encourage you to go take a look at David's piece, but cosmetic bias is really the idea that the images in the textbook represent diversity, where the rest of the text would not. In other words, it's not integrated into the actual information that's included. It's maybe still fairly stereotypical in terms of the role models that would be presented, the impact that various people have had on the field might be male-dominated if we're talking about the STEM areas. And so that's really what I meant by cosmetic bias when we're looking at textbook materials. Support services is another root cause. The lack of any of these things can be the reason why students are not participating in non-traditional or STEM-related programs. And some of these are huge financial issues, and others can be very simple fixes. So it's everything from tutoring to access to childcare, transportation, financial aid, books, equipment, tools, and clothing, tuition, modification of the curriculum and equipment, student teacher aids, and lots of things. I'm sure that many of you on this call could probably rattle off lots of things in addition to this. But again, remember, Perkins funds can be used to support any of these support services and activities that are going on, especially as it relates to special population students. And students who are pursuing non-traditional careers are considered part of the special population group. The link to David Sadker's website, I don't have right here at my fingertips, but it's David Sadker. It's S-A-D-K-E-R. If you Google his name, I'm sure it will come up, okay? What about occupational segregation and choice? One of the things that we know, again, I'm sort of now going to move out of the school influence here and a little bit into the employment end of things, the occupational end of things, business and industry end. One of the things we know is that we have definite segregation in terms of occupational participation in this country. There are mindsets about what's men's work and what's women's work, although I will say that these are changing, but primarily they're changing in the areas of the professions and not wholeheartedly throughout the occupational scheme. There are what we call traditional versus non-traditional careers. In the case in which we use it for accountability purposes, we're talking about non-traditional career being those where less than 25% of the individuals employed in that career are from non-traditional or from one gender or another. We hear a lot about the glass ceiling, but there's also the sticky floor. And the sticky floor concept is really about low-wage, low-pay types of occupations that tend to be, and I think wholeheartedly we could say this is true, they're traditionally female occupations, and it's very difficult for women to often move out of those occupations. So low-wage occupations tend to be traditionally female. And there are issues related to pay equity sort of in this whole idea around occupational segregation and choice. And so how do students see this in relationship to their, whether or not they actually have the option to choose a career that is not traditional for their gender? Now, the issue of wage potential can also have huge impact, primarily positively for women, negatively potentially for men. However, I will say that men are earning significantly higher wages than women in the nursing fields, which is a non-traditional career area for men. But when we look at the STEM arena in terms of women's participation, traditionally female occupations pay significantly less than traditionally male occupations. And so what we have happening here is that as women are entering male-dominated career fields, their wage earning potential is hugely increased. And that can be a very positive influencer for student career choice. And the thing that's interesting, however, though, is that when men and women are employed in the same occupation and have the same factors, their length of time in that career field, their level of experience and education, they tend to earn less than men. And although I'm sure many of you in the education arena, this is not particularly an area in which you are going to have huge influence. One of the things that we do in our work is try to work on issues related to pay equity and really working with business and industry on this issue and really looking for parity in terms of pay gaps. The shrinking of pay gaps are very important. But wage potential can be a positive influencer for women in STEM fields. So those are basically all of the root causes that we were able to distill out of the research. Now, that's a lot of stuff. And so the question really is, well, how do you identify which ones of these things happen to be coming into play on your campus? One of the things is that you want to search for, again, for the most direct and highest impact cause. Some of these causes may not necessarily be the thing that's really playing the central role on your campus or in your situation. And so employing some systematic evidence-based process to do that is very important. We encourage you to draw on current research and evaluation, and basically that's what we've attempted to do here by distilling the research for you and identifying these root causes. But what you need to do in your circumstance is to formulate and test a theory or hypothesis about what you think the root cause might be. And there's a whole process in doing that. If you go to our website, the 5-step process, program improvement process, resource materials are there. And there's a handbook specifically that addresses many of how to actually do this type of assessment. But I'm going to give you a couple of resource tools, too. We encourage you to use multiple methods and data sources, and you're not likely to find a single cause. You may find many causes, but you're going to have to really sort of analyze them in such a way that helps you identify which ones are the most direct. Now, we've already reviewed the research literature for you. Unless you really like to do that sort of thing, you don't need to do it. We're actually in the process of revising the root causes document that I referenced earlier that we did, those tables, if you've had a chance to look at it yet. And we'll have a new piece out for you by the beginning of the year that will have all the current research included in it. One of the things you can do is look at institutional reviews, conducting focus groups, peer benchmarking, how are you doing as compared to others, doing interviews and surveys with specific groups. Remember, we talked about parents and their influence. What do they think about this issue? Certainly knowing where students stand in relationship to some of these things is also very important. And bringing people together who have stake in this and brainstorming what they think their theory is also relative to this as well. I'd encourage you to go to the STEMequitypipeline.org website, and at the bottom of the website page, you can find some survey instruments. There's a piece on how to conduct interviews and how to conduct focus groups. Again, the 5-step program improvement process training resource link is under the resources menu. And down at the bottom of the resources page, there's a section on conducting a study of root causes. And there's a reference there to a zip file. If you download this, it includes in it a whole series of instruments, assessment instruments, and things that you can use to provide you with a way to do this. The other resource I'd like to lead you to is the Illinois Center for Specialized Professional Support. Actually, if you just Google ICSPS, you can find their website. When you download this PowerPoint, this is a hyperlink, the blue New Look Self-Study hyperlink will take you right to their website. But they've done a really great job of developing an online tool for schools to use to identify root causes for non-traditional participation and completion. And I'd encourage you to go take a look at that resource too. As far as analyzing and evaluating potential causes, you're going to really be looking at grouping those causes. Once you've identified what you think the root causes are, there may be some that are within your control and some that are outside your control that you're just going to have to throw away. And that's an important process to do. And then the next thing is to basically select the root causes that you feel have the strongest theory and evidence to support them from the research that you've done. In other words, you've found out from more than one group or more than one individual that that tends to be a barrier for students. You focus on those that have the most direct impact on the performance gap that you're most interested in, that address the most critical needs for the students that you're trying to help increase their options, that have the best opportunity to have the most impact on your performance. I mean, there may be some root causes that have little influencers, but probably trying to find the one that has the biggest, broadest influence is most important. And of course, probably more importantly than any of those things is which root cause, the selection of a strategy certainly, but which root cause to change are supported by stakeholders who will help develop and implement those solutions. Because there may be some root causes, some barriers that you find, institutional barriers, barriers within the school that the folks who have the opportunity to change those are not willing. And so again, those you have to sort of toss out with the bathwater. So, question is, which root cause do you think is the most common barrier for students considering a non-traditional career in your circumstance? If you were to develop a theory around the barriers that you think students are facing in your institution, which one of these, and I just selected a few from the list that we reviewed today, might you think would be the most common one or potentially would come out on top if you did an assessment? And we'll see a polling option will come up here in just a minute. Is it career guidance practices? Is it instructional strategies? Is it what's happening in the classroom? Is it the fact that you have an issue with a lack of role models on your campus? Is it the fact that students that are involved in your programs don't have the opportunity for early exposure, that their early exposure experiences are very traditional in nature? Is it an issue of self-efficacy? Do girls who have the ability to potentially do well in STEM areas feel not validated by making those choices? Are there issues of whether they have a strong sense of self? Is it the school climate? Is there sort of a lack of administrative support around this whole issue? Do you think parents are the real kicker here and they're the ones who potentially are influencing students, and so educating them is really important? Or is it the fact that you've got some climate between students to students in terms of there being this climate on the school of making a non-traditional choice is not an acceptable thing? So hopefully the poll, there it is, pops up. You have 30 seconds to answer this. Basically, you can choose which root cause you think is the most common barrier for students. Select the radio button, and at the bottom, choose the submit at the end, and we'll see the results here in just a minute. But I'm going to go ahead and flip forward while you're doing that and remind you that the 5-step process has 5 steps. We've just talked about step 2, which is identifying root causes. Next, we'll be moving on to step 3, choosing best solutions, which is, I know, where everyone really wants to be. We always like to talk about those great programs that are going on out there, but it was really important, I think, for us to step back first and really look at documenting performance results, making sure we know where we've got gaps in performance, looking at the barriers that students are facing, which of those barriers seem to be coming into play. So then now when we move forward to the next webinar and talk about choosing best solutions, that you can think more clearly about which solution might be most effective in your circumstance. So when we look at the responses, looks like we have a fairly broad-brushed interest in terms of the root causes here. Some think it's early exposure. That tends to be a very popular one. Looks like early exposure and parental and family support have high votes here, 16 out of the 87 people registered for this webinar. And then next, looks like self-efficacy. So building self-esteem is an important component of this, that this group thinks has great influence. So, yeah, I mean, it's all over the place, and the thing that you need to know is it's not one or the other of these. What's important is that you discover which of these barriers tends to be at play on your campus. Let me bring to your attention the fact that we've got 2 webinars coming up. Wednesday, December 17th is our next one, specifically on stereotype threat. I'm really looking forward to this one. Bettina Prasad, who's at Cal Poly Pomona in California, has done a lot of research on stereotype threat. The title of this webinar is Interactive Effects in the Theory of Planned Behavior, examining attitudes, norms, control, and stereotype threat to predict girls' math performance and intentions. It should be a very interesting webinar about the issue of stereotype threat and its impact on girls' performance in mathematics and what teachers can do to alleviate that effect, change that effect, shrink the effect. All of those things will be a very important component of that. The other is Tuesday's webinar, the next step in the 5-step process, step 3, identifying effective strategies, will occur in January, Tuesday, January 13th at 2 o'clock Eastern Time. And we'll be taking a look at effective strategies to eliminate root causes for low participation and completion of women and girls in STEM-related CTE programs, and hope that you would participate in that webinar with us as well. So I know we're it's 2 minutes after 3 is what my laptop says to me. And so I'm just going to quickly scroll down here on some of these questions and see if, looks like most of them have to do with issues related to technical stuff. I mentioned how to spell David Sadker's last name, so we're good with that. Do women at managerial positions tend to favor other female employees more than male employees? I'm going to refer you to Dr. Cuban and Sevo's paper on bias theory, because there is a very interesting research piece that was done on this that's quoted there. And the answer is that in all cases, men or women, both genders in managerial positions tend to favor men in most occupational areas. So take a look at that. It's a very interesting piece of information. Again, has to do with gender schema and the idea of accumulated advantage. We have, although this isn't a question, I'm going to read it to you because it's from one of our colleagues in Missouri. So just wanted to share with you that I had a gender workshop with about 60 educational staff in which we had them do the implicit bias assessment. Many were not happy with their results. Many don't want to be aware of their biases. I loved it. So I'd encourage you to go take a look at the Harvard implicit bias assessment and see how biased you are. It's often an eye-opener and certainly a tool for many of you who are in a position to work with others that you can use. At this point, I think that I've answered all the questions. Greg, are there any other questions that I am overlooking here that I need to?
There's some that I sent in as Google Greg that people put in the chat, so they look like they're answered.
Okay.
You might want to quickly look at those.
All right, hang on a second here. Let me take a quick peek. Here at the end you're talking about.
Yeah, in the Q&A section.
Okay, do you feel higher education institutions have any voice toward industry and supporting women's access to careers, leadership roles, flexible schedules? Certainly they do. You know, higher education in many of the STEM arenas, and probably I could say most of the STEM fields, higher education is the source of the workforce for STEM companies. And in many ways, that is a really important relationship that needs to be built between the workforce provider and the workforce recipient. And higher education institutions have a really good role that they can play, and especially reaching down to community colleges and secondary partners and helping bridge that gap between business and industry and education. There's a lot of work that's being done in this area. Many of the associations of industry groups, diversity and gender issues are really strong in their agendas. And so certainly working with business and industry, I think, is a really important role. Can you identify more research about the significance of role models on STEM career choice by youth and other than the 2 key publications you've mentioned? Actually, if you go to the one publication I mentioned that we've done on root causes, if you go there to the back of it, there's about 50 research pieces that are referenced that can lead you to other sources. There are 2 websites I'll reference you to. One is Assessing Women and Men in Engineering. It's aweonline.org. And they have a series of research briefs on that site, and although I can't tell you for sure. I'm almost positive there's one dealing with role models. The other one that probably would have some good information on role models as well is MentorNet. MentorNet is an online mentoring site where it's basically for women and girls in STEM. They can connect with role models across the country. And they also include a resources section that probably has some references to research because their interest, of course, is really in the role model arena. So that may be two other resources that may be useful to you. Let's see. I'm going to quickly see if there are any other questions. If you go to the, let's see, there was a question about, I'm going to take one more question here, and I'm just scrolling down to see if there's anything else. Greg, is there any particular question you think I need to answer?
Not necessarily. There's two that just jumped in at the very bottom.
Oh, okay. All right, the question is the gap between white girls and African American girls greater than, equal to, or less than the gap between white boys and African American boys? Or do the gaps mirror a more general race, ethnicity gap? Lisa, if you go to AUW, I'm pretty sure it's just AUW.org, and on their website you can get the report, you can download the report they did called Where the Girls Are, and there are actually some really great graphs and charts in that report that shows this specifically. I can't tell you, all I can tell you is that white girls and white boys are higher in the performance. If you look at this chart, specific chart, they outperform all of the other racial groups except for Asian boys and girls are also higher than white boys and girls. So take a look at that, and it's different for math than it is for science, but I can't quote exactly the gaps, but there are different gaps between the boys and the girls in some of the racial groups than there are between white boys and white girls. In other words, the gap is larger. Take a look there. The bias assessment you can get at Project Implicit. If you Google Project Implicit, Project, and then Implicit, Implicit, it'll get you right to the link. So if you just Google Project Implicit, that'll take you right there. The last question is, the root causes for girls seem very much like that for students of color. Are there key differences to note? And that is an excellent question. One of the things that we are now in the process of doing, reviewing the research, is more information about the intersection of race and gender. And although at this point I can't really speak directly to this, I would say that in the next piece that we do, you'll see more reference to that sort of thing. Our first sort of cut at this was looking specifically at gender-based research, which a lot of it doesn't have. It's not as robust around the issue of race and the cross-reference of gender. But there's more current research now that really looks at that, so that we'll be including in our next analysis. But although other than the things that I mentioned, that the gaps tend to be significantly different when you disaggregate by race and gender, and certainly issues around socio-economic status are huge in terms of non-traditional career choice too, and I mentioned some of those things earlier. But I do think that many of the root causes are very, very similar, because basically we're looking at disenfranchised individuals, people who are on the fringe, who are not part of the sort of traditional core. They're making choices outside the regular career options, and certainly individuals who are of color and have made non-traditional career choices probably face multiple barriers beyond just certainly their non-traditional career choice too. Okay, I'm 10 minutes over. We try to always keep these webinars to an hour, but I appreciate those of you who stayed on and continued with us. Again, let me encourage you to participate in the next two webinars that we have scheduled on Wednesday, December 17th on Stereotype Threat with Bettina Cassad from Cal Poly Pomona, and on Tuesday, January 13th on Step 3, Identifying Effective Strategies. You'll be joining me again for that webinar. Greg, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. Remember that this webinar will be available on the www.stemequitypipeline.org website under the Professional Development heading, and then under the Archived Webinars in the next few days. When you close your WebEx program, a few survey questions will open up your web browser that we would like for you to answer for us. Thank you for your time.